Hello and welcome everyone to the Varsity Tutors StarCourse series. Today we are live from Rome because we all know that Rome is one of the most influential and important empires of all time, but it's harder to get a straight answer to how did it become that way and then what happened to it after it was at its height. Fortunately, we are live at the scene and with one of the foremost experts out there. We've got Dr. Darius Arya here. You may know him as an archaeologist and TV star taking us on all these adventures. He's going to help us find out how did Rome become the world's most dominant empire, probably of all time, and what happened in the aftermath. Now, a couple things before I turn it over to Darius to tell us where we are in Rome and get us started there. Remember, when in Rome, do as the Romans do. And one of the things they were great at was communication. We know a lot about them because they document a lot of things. We're going to do that here too. You see there's a chat box to the right of the screen. Please, throughout the class, Darius is going to ask you some questions to find out what you know, think, and want to know. So answer those questions in the chat there. Also, at any point you have any questions for him, we're fortunate to have one of the world's foremost Roman Empire experts here. Ask your questions in the chat at any time. And in the last 10 minutes or so of class, I'll make sure I get to ask him, interview him with as many of your questions as I can so we can get as many answers as we can too. Last thing, it's not a trip to Rome if you don't have a picture to prove that you were there. So make sure you've got a camera nearby. And in about 45 minutes, we're going to give everybody a chance to lean into the screen, take a vacation from Rome selfie with Darius there. And if you upload it to Instagram, tag Darius, tag Varsity Tutors, you'll be entered to win a prize package that includes an ancient Rome project kit that's really cool. I'm underselling it by not having a great name for it, and a spot in Ancient Adventures Club this fall with Varsity Tutors. So all kinds of reasons to stay engaged, stay excited. But this class is 2,000 years in the making. Don't let me belabor it anymore. Let me give you your teacher for today, Darius Arya.
Hey guys, thanks for joining me here in Rome. I am standing in Rome, just outside the walls. These are the famous walls that will protect the city for quite some time till eventually Rome is sacked, where the walls still exist. Now, our timeline for today is we're going to be starting with the idea that all roads lead to Rome, so the empire is at its peak. We're going to move on to Rome wasn't built in a day. How did that grand empire get created? How did it evolve? And it didn't fall in a day either. So it's not one moment in time, it's several. There's going to be a gradual decline in empire. And finally, we'll move on to what comes next. After the empire, what happens next? And we'll conclude with some lasting lessons about ancient Rome. Now, the question I want to start off with is, what is a famous saying about Rome? Let me know. What's famous? When you think about Rome, what do you say? All roads lead to Rome, right? Rome wasn't built in a day. How about witty wiki? So, and when in Rome, do as the Romans do. So in the context of the decline and fall of Rome, what do these phrases mean? They underline the longevity of the empire. They underline the fact that so much that Rome achieved was left behind in material sense, with monuments, with ideas, with inscriptions, and with art. So ancient Rome has left a lot of impression upon us, and its impact is so great. So here's a map of the empire at its greatest extent. And that is in the reign of the Emperor Trajan. And he reigns from 98 to 117. And we're thinking about the reach of Rome. Now, statistically, it's around 60 million people. Statistically, it's 25% of the population of the entire world. They had connections through the Silk Road to China. They controlled ports in the Red Sea. They extended from Britain to Syria. They're controlling that whole strip of North Africa. And they have an expansive empire. So much so that the legacy of all of those cities of Europe that you see on the map can trace their beginnings to ancient Rome. Flip it. So let's take a look at Rome at its peak in this first little video and look at the impressive monuments and architecture of ancient Rome.
There was nothing like ancient Rome in the Imperial Period. Here is the venue, the Circus Maximus for chariot racing, holding 250,000 people. Behind it is the Palace of the Emperors. This was a city that had incredible amounts of water brought into the city through the aqueduct channels that they pioneered. It was a city that could sustain a population of up to 1 million people. And of course, there were great venues besides the Circus Maximus. There was the Colosseum, blood sport for all. This venue, the Colosseum, held 50,000 inhabitants. And when we take a look at the empire, 60 million people, all under the jurisdiction of Rome. Here is the city of Pompeii. We get a sense of urbanized creations all throughout that sprawling empire. Of course, the Romans said that they were pious and venerated the gods. The gods were on their side, and that's why they obtained this magnificent empire. The epicenter for so much of the empire is here, the Roman Forum, with piazzas, law courts, and of course, temples. The gods always supporting their efforts in war and in peace. And Constantine, to an extent, exemplifies the culmination of those attitudes and doesn't even need to be in Rome anymore. He creates another capital in the East. But what a legacy. Art, architecture here, frescoes from a Pompeian villa. It truly was something amazing, and there's so much of it is preserved. What an incredible legacy. And these people, the provinces, the people that were captured, ultimately captured the hearts and minds of the Romans themselves and were big protagonists in the empire for centuries.
So we're talking about Rome at its peak, and this truly was an empire of innovation. So I'm going to say a few words about art and architecture to follow up on the video, plumbing and aqueducts, and then Roman transportation and trade. So keep in mind, at the time of the rise of Rome, what was everyone doing? 90% of the people were farmers. They're involved in agriculture. It's subsistence living. Times were tough. So there are kingdoms, there are some success stories. But what Rome does is it takes over an enormous landmass and creates more cities than ever before had been created in that empire and allowed for this new urban development. So with those cities came the glorious architecture, the engineering behind the architecture as well. So if we want to think about the poured concrete dome of the Pantheon, still the largest unreinforced concrete dome. We want to think stadium. Let's talk about aqueducts, the engineering involved there. So it's a gravity flow system. The water's coming from a stream, a spring, a river, even a lake, and they're going great distances, even up to 80 miles is the longest one. And it's not just in Rome, but Rome's going to have the most. It's a city of water with fountains and there's running water in bath complexes. It's truly an extraordinary achievement. And the plumbing, well, the plumbing is terracotta and the plumbing is lead. Lead because they've got so much of it, because when they refine silver that they're extracting from southern Spain, they've got a lot of lead as a byproduct that they can use for the piping that's soft and malleable. So a lot of technology involved here. And then of course, it's all because of great transportation and trade. And that trade is extensive and allows people opportunity, allows a lot of people to move to different parts of the empire, allows a lot of people to become wealthy, and allows for the success of the empire. And of course, in all that transportation and ease of getting around, you've got the ease of the military getting around as well. So let's ask this question. When in Rome, in a way you are, wherever you are, because of what Rome has given to us. We can look at our modern calendar system, ultimately indebted to Julius Caesar, who reforms the ancient calendar. Are you born in the month of July? Are you born in the month of August? Those are named after two titans in Roman politics, Julius Caesar and Augustus, the first two emperors. What about the names of some of our modern structures? If you go to California and LA, you've got the Colosseum as a venue for football named after the Colosseum. Or if you're a Lakers fan, you go to the Forum. So there are ways in which we're recalling those kind of grand venues of ancient Rome. What if you use Roman numerals like Super Bowl 27, right? And you've got XXV11. It's because, or II, it's because the weight that comes with using those Roman numerals. So many different ways we tap into a lot of their tradition. If you go to the bank, so many times growing up as a kid, you go to a bank and it kind of looks like a temple. If you go to the Supreme Court in Washington, D.C., it looks like a temple. So you're giving weight and big value to these spaces by making them recall the past of institutions which were for a long time so important and then ultimately remained important. So let's think now about this evolution of the empire. Who do you think was the architect, so to speak? Who had the grand vision of creating the Roman Empire? Let's hear some names here. Who do you think made the empire? Who's responsible? Julius Caesar, Mark Antony, Augustus. So we're getting a lot, Cicero, okay? We're getting a lot of names of famous Romans. And the bottom line is, Romulus and Remus. Romulus and Remus. You can say it all starts with Romulus. So he founded the city, so he had that vision of something great. But the reality is, these are all really important people. But the secret is that Rome wasn't planned as an empire. Rome didn't intend in conquering the world. It kind of just happened. So in other words, I'm living in my village, and 2 miles over there, you're living in your village. And every March, the snows have melted and it's time to go to war. We go to war for 4 or 5 months. Then the summer's over, it's the fall, we're harvesting. And then it's cold, so we don't go to war anymore. And then we go through that cycle again. So there's no powerful plan involved. But over time, Rome does better. Rome is more successful at not just beating up its neighbors, but also ultimately co-opting their values and their ideas, and even incorporating the people into their own village. We'll just step aside here for a second. Sorry, because the car is coming. Okay. So so let's just consider that Rome is informing its empire. It's reactive. It's responding to emergencies. It's responding to attack. It's responding to a plague. And ultimately, we want to think about it as it's building itself up and expanding and being successful, it has to roll with the punches and it has to continually reinvent itself. So ultimately, no, there is no grand architect, there is no grand plan, but I think overall, as a Roman, you felt that you were tying into a larger and larger legacy, and that it was something to be a part of, and it was something that you wanted to maintain, and ultimately something that you could build upon. Okay, so let's think of this statement. Roman history is world history. So we're looking at a bunch of timelines, okay? So with the top one there, it gives us the entire Roman Empire, and that Roman Empire continues in the east afterwards. It's known as the Byzantine Empire. So that's a huge amount of time, thousands and thousands of years. The western half, let's say, and the cohesive nature of that empire will collapse sooner. So it's not as long, and we can compare it to the British Empire, and we can consider it to the United States history. Look how young we are. Look how young and how little we have actually occupied the scale of time. Now turn to your own lives and turn to the phones in your pocket and turn to your use of technology and TV and computers. That kind of revolution is not even 100 years old. So in terms of looking at the Romans, in terms of looking at what an impact they had, it's also because they were around as an influence for such a long time. Thousands of years, they got seeped into the art and the technology and the traditions and the religions of the peoples there, of the places that they occupied. Turkey and the Middle East, North Africa, and all of Central Europe and Britain. So simply put, there's not a grand plan within that big time frame of the presence and the prominence of Rome, but it was something that, through that time, they made incredibly critical decisions. They sustained their efforts, and they built upon that empire with lasting foundation, and that's one of the reasons why it lasted so long. So we can ask this question then. How did Rome become an empire? Learning from its neighbors, recruiting new citizens, through innovation, and of course, conquest. So these are the kind of things that we can revolve our conversation around. They're defeating people in war, but they're also incorporating their values. They're inviting them in. They're making a lot of the people that they conquered into their own citizens. And of course, they have their own innovations, and they're spreading their colonies throughout the territories that they occupied as a way to Romanize further the people that they had conquered. So, how do historians mark the fall of Rome? Because that's the million-dollar question. So, let's see what you think is the main moment. What's the event? The assassination of Julius Caesar is a very important event. That's more about the fall of the Republic rather than the fall of the empire. The sack of Rome, and there were many. The transference of the capital from Rome to Constantinople. These are all really great, valid points. We have some flashpoints. We have the first sack of Rome in 410, Alaric the Goth, and we'll talk about him more shortly. In 455, the Vandals sack Rome again. And of course, the last emperor that's ruling officially all of the empire is in 476. So we get some ideas that things aren't going too well in the 5th century. And of course, another big war breaks out and trashes the city in the beginning of the 6th century. So there are a whole bunch of, let's say, key events that we can identify and talk about already in the 6th and 5th centuries AD. So here now we have two maps. Now the purple one is coming back to our buddy Trajan. Trajan, emperor from Spain, becomes the emperor in 98, wins a big war in the east, and extends the empire to its greatest extent. So when we look at that map, it's conquest, it's success, it's the free trade they instituted, it's the taxation of the provinces, it's the incorporation of more people into the empire. It is success to its greatest extent of what empire was about for the Romans. Now, the other map shows you a split empire. And that's how it's going to be ruled. You can kind of say, even before there's an official physical split of East and Western Empire. In other words, the East is always going to be a little bit different because there are massive kingdoms in place that are conquered by the Romans. In the West, it was more like beating up villages and less developed infrastructure and urbanization. So you could say, in the West, always the Romans are creating more of those cities and infrastructure. And in the East, where they spoke Greek, as a kind of a cohesive nature, that whole character is they're all speaking Greek. They already had a lot of kingdoms. They already had a lot of infrastructure. They already had a lot of big buildings and big cities. So there always is that division in the minds of the Romans, but it becomes a physical split really in the end of the 3rd century. It becomes the end of the 3rd century. And then when the empire falls and we see a split, it's the Western half that gets decimated and is never recuperated in the 5th and 6th centuries AD. But on the Eastern side, instead, it's got that longevity because the Byzantine Empire, who consider themselves Romans through and through, will actually continue to exist until 1453, when they're finally replaced by the Byzantine Empire. Okay, so that's really what we're getting, is that Rome is expanding in the 1st and 2nd centuries AD, kind of pushing out, pushing out, pushing out, pushing out. And then the next chapter is Rome has to deal with the fact that there are going to be pressures and there are going to be movements that's going to be constricting them further, and they'll never be at that great extent that they were in the 2nd century AD. So it really is a kind of interesting way to think of East and West. Let's take a look now at how the empire began to gradually decline and fall.
Here's the grand empire of the Romans at its greatest extent in the reign of Trajan, who died in 117. They're not going to hold on to this for more than another century. And really the crisis comes in the 3rd century, when a lot of the people that were conquered are now on the offensive and Rome has to play defense. You can see in the following map that these incursions are taking place already as early as the 2nd century AD, and the invasions are coming from different locations. So Rome has to be mobile and the army has to transfer oftentimes to the furthest extent of the boundaries as more and more peoples, the Huns, the Vandals, the Visigoths, are trying to get inside the empire, as opposed to the Romans earlier pushing out. So you have a transformation of the military, you have a different fighting style, and yet at the same time, the people you've been fighting for centuries are getting used to the way that you fight. And to a degree, they're going to be slowly getting the upper hand. And it's going to lead to the sack of Rome in 410 by the Goths. It's going to lead to the sack of Rome in 455 by the Vandals. And you can say, by and large, the city never really recovers, although there are some attempts to regain that lost land. But already in the 270s, the Emperor Aurelian builds a wall circuit. Here you can see it traced out with this red line. That's 12-mile circuit, which is the famous Imperial Wall around Rome. It did the trick for the 3rd century. It did the trick into the 4th century. It's a different matter in the 5th century. And one of the main reasons is because Rome is getting depopulated, so you don't have as many people to man the walls. But still today you can see how much of these walls are intact. You can drive around here, see how massive they are, what a deterrent they were to so many people that tried to sack Rome for so many centuries. Of course, it's very well preserved, so much of it is still here. And it impacts still today on our experience in the modern city, the contemporary city of Rome. Ancient Rome is always present, and we're very much aware of the decline and fall of Rome as we make our way through the city every single day.
All right, so let's take a look now at a specific moment, one of these critical moments, and it is August 24th, AD 410, which is the day that Alaric the Goth sacked Rome. So we saw the road around the Aurelianic wall circuit. You heard the noise, you got a sense of the wind whipping through your hair, and you see that it's a very imposing kind of a wall circuit, 12 miles in length. That did not stop Alaric the Goth. So this is sort of the shot heard around the world, because when's the last time Rome had been sacked was 800 years prior. So think about that level of success of Rome. It was unchallenged for such a long time. And the thing is that the military, the Romans were holding off Alaric the Goth for quite some time, but they're also dealing with him, bribing him, keeping him away. He's a Goth whose army had been co-opted by the Roman military for quite some time, but never allowed to become a Roman citizen. So he's one of those others that's allowed to work with the Romans, but never allowed to become a Roman citizen. So ultimately, he's not satisfied and is going to march on Rome. But keep in mind that although Rome is being sacked and he's going to breach the walls, Rome wasn't quite the Rome of the time of Trajan. Times were different, and Rome had no longer been the capital for a couple of centuries. So you have multiple capitals being created in the course of the history of the later Roman Empire. And of course, finally, in the 330s, Constantine is going to be creating this new empire's capital of Constantinople that we saw some images of. And ultimately, Alaric's moment of glory, sacking the city and stealing away gold and precious relics and whatnot, it's not the end of Rome. Rome's population is still going to be largely intact. Grand buildings are going to be destroyed, but the legacy continues, and Rome is going to rebound, and whatever damage to the walls that happened is going to be repaired. Okay, so this is that kind of big warning shot that something critically wrong is happening in the empire. But again, at that time, Rome still wasn't that important in the grand scheme of things. It was more about its legacy. It was more about the fact that Rome was, well, everyone was a Roman at that time within the Roman Empire. You weren't a Constantinopolitan, you were a Roman. So Rome still mattered, even though it wasn't the center of power of the Roman Empire. It is a good example of things that were going in the wrong direction. Okay, so how did Rome fall? Why did Rome fall? We've got all kinds of factors, is what bottom line comes down to. And you could take the same objective look at saying, why is the United States of America the sole superpower? So you go, what happened to the Soviet Union? And then why do we get this sort of permanent position already after World War II? What had happened to our allies? What the devastation in Europe and so on and so forth? So when you're looking at history that you may be more familiar with, you know it's a complicated story. So the internal factors are many. It can be plagues. It can be soil exhaustion. Some people say that because of the lead pipes, there was sterility issues, that they weren't making enough Romans, although that one's pretty much debunked. But issues of trade, issues of infighting, that the bureaucracy is becoming too big, even change of religion, change of beliefs. Those are internal factors. External factors, it became too large and too unruly to manage. And there's real weight in that assessment, because after Trajan makes the empire to its greatest extent, his successor Hadrian immediately gives up a huge chunk of land that had just been captured by Trajan. So he says, like, it's just, we can't manage this. We're stretched too thin in terms of supplies and military. So that's one thing about it, is just maybe it's just gotten too big and too unruly, and more people are attacking us, nibbling, eating away at the fringe. We can't manage this, so we'll have to contract. Another idea you could say is that it served its purpose. It did its deed. It made this incredible system, and now it's taking off a life of its own. Another idea is it's evolving more than falling. And then again, there's a lot of weight to that assessment and that statement, because the Rome of Trajan and Hadrian, when they're building all this great stuff, they're building the Pantheon, they're building all the great imperial forums, it's not the Rome of the empire of the 4th century, right? And a lot of it is that the enemies outside the boundaries, they're pushing more, they're more organized, and they're used to dealing with the Romans. And the technology kind of gets more uneven on a level playing field. And therefore, Rome is going to have a tougher time dealing with the people that historically they were always beating up. Now they've got some issues. Now there are new factors, like Alaric the Goth. So let's think now about who filled the vacuum. Who took their place as the prominent kind of power of Europe, of the space held by the Romans? Let's hear from you who you think took over after Rome. Who's picking up the baton? Okay, the Greeks are a little bit early. The British, you could say, ultimately, because the British do have a grand empire, and of course it's global. Okay, the U.S., you could sort of say, some people talk about Pax Americana versus Pax Romana. There are ways in which we are taking up the baton about some of the values of Rome and its legal system. But let's think a little closer to home. The aftermath of the Roman Empire was not another empire. No one's ever going to hold it together as such. The East goes in a different direction. The historians call it the Byzantine Empire. They call it the Byzantine Empire, but essentially it is going to be a continuation of the values of Rome with that new capital of Constantinople. In the West, what happens? Well, you get the rise now of nations. Before they were provinces ruled by the Romans, but now Spain is becoming a country. The territories of Gaul are forming into France. Britannia is going to become Britain. But before they were all provinces dominated by, ruled by, the cities were grown by, urbanized by the Romans. Now they're taking a life of their own. So it's never going to be, no one ever had that power to co-opt and conquer all those nations again. So that Roman Empire per se is going to become more local and more fragmented. So the question now is, what comes next in the aftermath? And what we're going to have are three main things. So smaller states, we're going to have a kind of a religious revival in Rome. We're going to talk about the growth of the church in Rome. And then Byzantium, the Byzantine Empire, lives on. So in terms of the smaller states, the idea is that in a certain sense, the world is becoming a little more lawless with all these different kinds of waves of migrations and invasions that kind of tear apart the infrastructure of the Roman Empire. And in the aftermath, it's these different groups that move into the empire, settle down, and develop themselves into their own nations. There's a lot of infighting and a lot of struggle for territory, but essentially it is these inherent individual states or countries that are forming, as I already mentioned, like France, like Germany, like ultimately Portugal divided from Spain. Now, in terms of Rome, Rome is a fascinating story because to a large degree, it really didn't matter anymore. But when you have the rise of Islam and you have this very successful, massive Arab army coming out of Arabia, taking over the Middle East, taking over North Africa in the 7th century, into the 8th century, even part of Spain, then the access of all these Christians that have flourished in the empire from Constantine and onward, they can't go to what they call the Holy Land. They can't go to Jerusalem. They can't go to the places where Jesus lived. What's going to stand in as the new Jerusalem? Where's the new Holy Land? Rome provides, because they have a lot of saints buried there, including Peter, the first saint. So one of the reasons why I'm just so fascinated, I remain fascinated by Rome, is that it remains a protagonist in so many great empires that you read about. They flourish, they're extinct, and the situation totally changes. Rome remains a protagonist because of the way in which the church develops and remains an important factor. And in the early church, they're the ones that are also going to be approving of who becomes king. So imagine you're the kingmaker. You can say, no, you're not a good Christian, and be away with you. So they had a lot of power, and that led to a great wealth, and they own a papal state as a landholder and a stakeholder in Italy. The third one, again, is Byzantium, the Byzantine Empire. It does have its ups and downs. It's been involved in a lot of crusades to liberate the Holy Land with Europe. And ultimately, it is going to exist in a very small state, but still exist until 1453, when they're finally conquered by the Turks. And then you get the rise of the Ottoman Empire in Turkey, and their capital is going to be Constantinople, which is going to ultimately be renamed Istanbul. So let's watch this video now on the Roman legacy.
With Constantine legalizing Christianity, so much changed in the empire in the early 4th century. And of course, he makes a new capital, Constantinople, in today's Istanbul. It's eventually going to get its own walls, massive walls for protection, but it's different from Rome. It's on the sea, and the focus is to the east, not to the west. And the Emperor Justinian builds some of the greatest churches you've ever seen. Here's the Hagia Sophia in the 6th century. And it's Justinian that with his building and with his mentality, he wants to recuperate the western half that had fallen away for more than a century. Here he is in red, trying to reconquer what's in the west to unify that capital. It doesn't work. And in the west, you get the rise of Christianity. Here, the seat of Catholicism is St. Peter's with the tomb of Peter. So it's a different legacy, and it's a city that needed to be protected, still utilizing the Aurelianic wall circuit, still utilizing what was left behind from ancient Rome. Of course, it's always a quarry site, and so much of the antiquities are going to be dismantled, recycled, and used to make new churches and a new life. And of course, the greatest things of the ancient Romans, like the Pantheon of Hadrian, are converted into churches, preserving that legacy.
Okay, so at this point, you guys can say that you came, you saw, and what are you going to say? What's the end of that? Like Julius Caesar, that you had a great time, that you learned something new today, that you conquered, you killed it. That's right. So those are great answers. Just think about this. We've covered a lot of material just now, and we covered it in the shadow of that grand wall, which we'll get up close and personal with just shortly. And I just want to keep in mind 3 big points, the takeaway points from today's lesson. So let's look back. How do we get an empire? How did the empire fall? What was the aftermath? So how do we get an empire? Well, it's not something you can really plan, right? But it is something that took on a momentum of its own. Rome had a formula. Rome accepted migrants. Rome made slaves and freed a lot of the slaves. Nobody else in the ancient world was doing this. So that city-state had an empire unlike anybody else because they co-opted people, they invited people in, and they gave them a slice of the pie, and it gave free trade and opportunity. And of course, it really flourishes with the creation of all these cities. And this had to be the epicenter, had to be the big city, the great city of 1 million people. Why did the empire fall? That's a tougher question. And there is no one way, one sentence to say it. There is going to be technology involved. It's going to be some luck that's involved. It's going to be that I have better equipment than the guys over there have better equipment. But they are going to be ultimately, running up to things that they had never encountered before and not having solutions to them. So, all good things come to an end. And the Romans knew that. When we have this guy named Polybius, who's writing at the time when Rome is destroying Carthage in the 2nd century BC, he looks at the general who's destroying Carthage and he says, this guy is crying. Why are you crying? It's because I realize that one day Rome too will fall. It's inevitable, right? And we talk about right now in politics, the decline of the United States of America. Sure, we're not going to be the superpower forever. All good things come to an end. Somebody else arrives in the scene. The equation changes. So there are a lot of complicated factors, but it's going to be financial for the Romans. It's going to be military for the Romans. It's going to be change in direction. The aftermath of that is that Rome is never forgotten. Rome looms large, not just in the movies and the books and the mythology and things like that, that we get really excited about when we read or we see, but it's palpable, it's tangible. Almost all the great capital cities of Europe were created by Rome. Vienna and Paris and London, for example. So they left their mark. They gave something positive. If it had all been about just enslaving people and making them give money and resources to the Romans, that empire would not have lasted not even one lifetime. But it lasts so long and has such, in many ways, a powerful and positive legacy is because it was never forgotten and was incorporated. Its ideas, its values, its successes live on today live on throughout Europe and the world, and many experiences that you have also in the United States, whether or not you're aware of it. So I think we can open up to some questions. Brian will step in and we can also get closer to the wall.
Yeah, two more things for everybody. One, Darius, we're going to line everybody up for that picture here in just a second. So two things for you guys to get ready for. Yeah. One, make sure you've got a camera ready because in just a second, we'll get Darius set up and make sure everybody has a chance. Lean into the screen, take a selfie with Darius and that beautiful background there live from Rome. I'll tell you about what you can win in a second, but we've got a great shot here. So let's go back live to Darius, get those cameras out and let's take pictures.
I don't know, say Ave, Ave. Ave Cesare.
Yeah, excellent. Thanks, Darius. And if you didn't get the perfect picture you want, we will have Darius back full screen. He may move around a little bit to answer questions at different spots. We'll get everybody the perfect.
We'll make our way to we'll make our way a little bit here to cross the street just so they can we get closer to the material.
Excellent. While you're doing that, we've got some questions. Keep your questions coming in. You guys have had some amazing ones thus far. We're even going to get some here from our live studio audience. We've got a handful of kids from our Ancient Adventures Club, which is one of the prizes you'll be able to win if you get that photo up on Instagram. So do that. We'll have the official handles to tag Darius Arya Diggs and Varsity Tutors. We'll put those up on a slide on the way out. But in the meantime, you guys have been asking some great questions. One of my favorites, Darius, while we're getting closer and closer to these structures is, how did the Romans build so many amazing buildings 2,000, 1,500, even more than that years ago that are still standing? How did they not fall down? What's the secret to building these giant buildings, walls, and monuments that stand the test of time?
Let me show you. That's a great question. So what do you guys use today? You know, you're making a prefabricated house where you can probably punch through the walls. You can't punch through marble, okay? So the building materials that they're using are fantastically resistant, concrete walls, hydraulic resistant. They're pouring them into the sea to make harbors in the salt water. They're also lifting up big blocks like this. So it's like, well, is that expensive? It is expensive, but it becomes the choice that there's almost a mechanized means of people working the quarries, some slaves and criminals as well, and prisoners are working them. But it is a system, in fact. And then we have the bricks. And we all know bricks today. Hey, bricks are expensive. These bricks here, again, it's manual labor, fired clay from the banks of the Tiber River. But again, very, very resistant. And this is the module for building so much of Rome. Then you can face it in marble, for example. We come over here. Here's a little chunk of marble. This is marble column right here. So they're recycling the material as well. This is actually a fluted column that's just stuck in here as a foundation. So the Romans, they reused everything. We talk about sustainability. The Romans were sustainable as well. There was no plastic. There was no oil-based economy. So everything can be reused. You can reuse brick, you can reuse marble. And of course, the stone lasts for generations and generations. So I think it's also just thinking about they're building in different materials. You know, you look at other civilizations and maybe you'll see a great tomb like in Egypt, but the cities don't generally survive because they're just not very, they weren't putting money into the infrastructure. The Romans did. So we'll find in Rome still today a 5-story apartment building because it's made of brick. So the Romans are kind of building to last.
Well, I'm glad they did. They've given us so many cool things to watch all these classes with you, Darius, to appreciate everything they've done. And thanks for such an amazing tour of all these places. We're going to come back to buildings in just a second. But right now we've got Arthur, one of our live studio audience kids from the Ancient Adventures Club here. Arthur, I know you've got a few questions, but we want to have you get one on air here for Darius. So we're going to unmute you here. And what's your question for Darius?
Can you still find ancient artifacts in Rome, or are they all found?
That's a great question. The answer is there's always going to be something new to discover. So yeah, there's a lot still to excavate. And even if a site like this, there are portions of the base or along these this wall circuit where we could find something new, we could find a new tomb or whatever. So nowadays in the city of Rome, it's because you're maybe gutting a building and you're going to renovate it. You want to put in an elevator. Oh, I just found part of a house. I just found a statue. Right? Something like that. So there's always going to be something that's going to be unearthed, and it's going to probably make the news.
That's fantastic. Thank you for that. And actually, we've done a bunch of these classes. For anybody, this class is being recorded right now. So if it's early on a Saturday for concentration, or you missed part of it or anything, go back to it. We also, in our last class, Darius, we were by that pyramid, and you sort of showed us how how much cool stuff is still underground because of the way that the city's been raised over time. So it does sound like there's a lot left to explore. I'm actually going to take us way back to a previous class. We had lots of questions on the Colosseum, and I know we did a class from there, about 8 or 9 months ago. A lot of people wanted to know, can you tell us more about the Colosseum? Where does it fit into to Roman history? And what do we know about the gladiators themselves and kind of what their lives were like?
So the Colosseum is built between 70 and 80 AD. It's in use for gladiatorial games until the 5th century. And then by the 6th century, people start living inside of it. There's a church that's put in the center arena. So what's happening by the 6th century, as we're talking about Rome being sacked and the empire kind of in the West being in a critical period, it's been attacked several times, been sacked several times. So it just becomes much more subsistence living. And much of the center at that point is really becoming abandoned. So Rome, the Colosseum, right at the same time is becoming a ruin, and it's not being used anymore. So people start stealing away the metal pins, stealing away the marble decoration. And they're really looking for a place to live that's safe, because the other buildings are starting to fall apart because there is no maintenance. So it's like all those cool movies that you're watching nowadays, these cartoons, kind of Armageddon, the end of civilization. Where do you live? You're searching people's apartments for a can of tuna because the supermarkets aren't open anymore. So it's that kind of apocalyptic kind of feel to it. So as a result, Rome moves forward. Rome eventually, with the church builds up again. They're building lots of churches and so forth. But the Colosseum is going to stand there as an unused monument. It's kind of like a symbol of the grandeur of that long lost empire. Now, what did the gladiators do? There are many different fighting styles. And initially, gladiators come in as slaves from different regions. So that's the name of the gladiator fighting style. The Thracian, the Gaul, the Samnite. But ultimately, it's about fighting styles. So then you have a short sword, you have a round shield, you use a bow and arrow, you use a trident. And you try to make these kind of matchups. It's usually one-on-one, dramatic, and at the same time inhibitive. So if I put you with you, you might be faster, but the other guy might have a heavier armor, so he's more protected. So you try to have that kind of tit for tat as these guys are paired up. They're not going to be usually the same people fighting each other.
Thank you. Yeah, fascinating place. For those who want to know more about the Colosseum, on the Varsity Tutors YouTube channel, we have a whole class on it that Darius did back in December or so. But let's move on and get a couple other questions answered. I want to thank Arthur for his question before. We've got another question from Dylan now in our live studio audience here. Dylan, what's your question for Darius?
So, at the fall of the Roman Empire, so many people were attacking. How was the army everywhere at once?
That's a great question. So they went. So what they did was, when they had the big empire, they put the majority of the troops in a couple of pressure points. So that can be in some parts of Morocco. It can be along the Danube River. It can be some off in the on the border over here with Judea and modern day Jordan. So by and large, the majority of people, and also in Britain, so by and large though, the people living in most of the empire, they weren't afraid of war. Rome gave them peace. So Italy is pretty much demilitarized, except for you need a lot of troops to protect the emperor from being killed in the city of Rome. Southern France, southern Spain, a lot of places are just pretty much demilitarized. because the empire really wouldn't have worked if you had to fight all the time. And yet we look at the history books and they did quite a lot of fighting, but they're fighting in certain concentrated areas, not fighting throughout the entire empire. That would have been impossible to maintain with the technology they had. And the most that the troops ever got up to was, 700,000 soldiers. And you can't really maintain them for very long. You kind of up the number in times of crisis.
Yeah, it is really amazing what the Romans were able to accomplish with all those limitations and challenges. So the fact that it lasted as long as it did is really incredible. Hey, last question for you, Darius, and then feel free to show us anything else you want us to. A lot of questions about you and about getting into Roman history. So I'll give you a combo question. Thanks again to Arthur and Dylan for your questions live on air, and for everybody else out there for asking such amazing questions. How did you get so interested in Rome, and what's your advice for kids today who are similarly inspired by Rome? How do they get involved? How do they get a job like yours?
I would say, for me personally, it was started off with Greek mythology. And if I were a kid today, I'd probably really like Percy Jackson and stuff like that. But when I was a kid, we didn't have Percy Jackson. We had just the original mythology, Bullfinch mythology, Mary Renault, her novels about some of the historical figures. I'd say read as much as you can. There are museums all over the world. Don't have to come to Rome, where you can get a taste of ancient cultures. And right here in the distance, you can see, the cars are coming right through here. I do ultimately like living in Rome as a base and having a modern contemporary city, and the cars are driving through the walls and all that good stuff. But it started off with a passion for the stories, the mythology, find the history. Then becoming an archaeologist, I like excavating. That's a lot of fun. But and the travel is great. But it's really read books, see the images, watch documentaries. A lot of good stuff on YouTube. And I think it's a great opportunity right now for you to get involved using Google Earth and so many great museum websites and so forth to get involved in a lot of that history in a way which was much more difficult when I was a kid.
Well, thank you for that, Darius, and thanks for just an amazing tour, sharing your love of Rome for us, and giving everybody else an opportunity to get involved. Darius mentioned he's an archaeologist, so I'm actually going to put up the final instructions here to be able to get your Instagram picture your picture up on Instagram and be entered to win a spot in Ancient Adventures Club. Another great way to further your knowledge of and interest in ancient civilizations. And the prize package includes a really cool project guide to be able to replicate some of the engineering feats of ancient Rome and learn a little bit more about those. So with that, I'll mention Darius is an archaeologist who studies some architecture. His Instagram handle is Darius Arya Dig. So let's give you that and also be able to tag Varsity Tutors on the way out. We look forward to seeing those pictures up on Instagram. We thank everyone for your participation, for some amazing questions, and we'll see everybody back here soon. I know all roads lead to Rome. We're actually going to take some of those roads out of Rome, and Darius is going to take us on some other archaeological adventures here throughout the fall and winter. So we'll see everybody back here soon.
You guys take care.